American pressure on Israel, not Israel, while visiting Israel, and unacceptable to Israel, to the land of Israel.
Welcome to Eyes on Israel. I'm Rabbi Pesach Walicki. This coming Tuesday, May 14th, is the 76th Independence Day of the State of Israel. The State of Israel was founded on May 14th, 1948. And today we'll be doing a special episode entirely dedicated to Israel's War of Independence. Israel, like America, achieved its independence under the cloud of war. We had to fight to attain our independence against enemies who wanted to destroy the nascent state. So Israel's story of independence and that war for independence, which we will tell you today, begins before May 14th, 1948 and ends after it. Joining me for this special Independence Day episode is our tour guide, Yaakov Aram. Thank you for joining us here on Eyes on Israel. We are standing in front of the Jerusalem municipal prison that was used by the British in the lead up to Israel's independence. Yaakov, tell us more about this place and why we're starting our story here.
Okay, so the British took over the country at the end of the First World War, and they made a commitment to the Jewish people that in the land of Israel, we would establish an independent Jewish state. But in the years that followed, the British betrayed us and backtracked on their promises. Appeasing the Arabs, they limited Jewish immigration to the land, and they started preventing us from building communities at a time when we needed it the most, in the dark days of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And even after the Second World War was over and the horrors of the camps became known to the world, the British didn't continue to help the Jews re-establish independence. Far from it. Holocaust survivors were captured by the Royal Navy and imprisoned in prisons in Cyprus and in other places, and were not allowed to make aliyah to the land.
So Yaakov, you're saying that even at the height of the Holocaust, when Jews were fleeing from Europe to find some safe harbor, the British were preventing Jews coming out of the camps, coming out of the Holocaust in Europe, from entering the land of Israel.
Correct. And even after the war was over, and there are survivors, they're not letting them into the land of Israel. They're putting huge limits on them and imprisoning them, survivors, in camps in places like Cyprus. And the young men and women of the land of Israel, the young Jewish people, have had enough and take up arms against the British. And I want to give you an idea of this war that we fought and are fighting is a war of the spirit. It says in the book of Zechariah, Lo b'koach v'lo b'chal ki im b'ruchi ama Adonai Tzevaot. Not by strength, not by physical strength, but by my spirit. And the story that we're sharing today is the story of the spirit, because on paper, there's no chance of beating the mighty British Empire. Would you have a few guns and grenades? You haven't got a chance. But that didn't stop the spirit of the fighters saying, we have to stand up for ourselves, for our people that have been abused. And those soldiers, the young men and women, soldiers of the underground, were captured by the British in many cases and brought to prison and put on trial, to be hanged. In their trials, they spoke strongly and firmly that they didn't recognize the rights of the British to try them even. And I want to focus on two guys in particular who were sentenced to death together, Moshe Barazani and Meir Feinstein, 19 and 20 years old, who had been captured having tried to attack British soldiers. They hadn't actually succeeded, in fact, and they were sentenced to be killed, to death by hanging. At their trial, they had spoken clearly that they don't recognize the British authority and that the British are on the wrong side of history, on the side of all those empires that have stood up throughout the generations against the Jews, and they will not succeed. And they were willing to go proudly to their deaths as fighters for the freedom of Israel. The story's crazy because they managed to have contact with their guys on the outside, and they hatched a plan to deprive the British hangman of his final victory by smuggling in grenades in oranges. And they were planning to blow themselves up and their hangman at the time of their execution. The plans went slightly off because someone who was close to them, a rabbi who had visited them and was giving them their last visits to encourage them in their last hours, had wanted to be present at the hanging, and they didn't want him to be hurt. So they decided the night before to proceed with their mission to basically take their own lives in the way of Samson, if you like, or Saul, perhaps in the biblical reference,
Or the fighters at Masada.
or the fighters at Masada, to say, we're going to deprive you of your privilege of trying to hang us with your rope. We will die as free men. And that's what they did. They sang a hymn together in their last moments, Adon Olam, something that we sing as part of the regular liturgy.
Which is a praise to God.
Praise to God. He's the master of all. They also, Mayor Feinstein wrote in his English, in his Bible that he gave to the British warden as a farewell gift. He had no idea what was happening. He wrote the following line: "It is better to die with ammunition in your hands than to live with your hands raised in surrender." And that is the
It
fight.
is better, let me say that again. It is better to die with ammunition in your hands than with your hands,
to live
than to live with your
hands raised
in surrender. That's reminiscent of, from the American Revolution, live free or die.
Absolutely. And that is the spirit that wins the war. And it starts here. Again, it's a year before independence. These fighters have been captured. They are executed here. But the spirit they represent is the spirit that's going to win through. That's April 1947, where Moshe Barazani and Meir Feinstein are executed here. It has to be said that, jumping ahead a bit, one of our prime ministers, Menachem Begin, who had been their commanding officer, put in his last will and testament, "Bury me on the Mount of Olives next to them." And if you go to see Menachem Begin, former prime minister's grave, he's buried next to these guys because he saw them as the source of inspiration. Not just them, but they're the example of the young fighters. This revolt against the British, which on paper had no chance, was one of the key factors that made the British realize they could not continue to hold the land of Israel against the will of the Jewish people. And it was one of the factors, together with the fact that basically the British Empire were bankrupt, that the British government decided to hand the problem, wash the hands of the problem, and hand the problem over to the United Nations. So in November of that year, they allowed the United Nations to decide what to do with this land. And the United Nations came up with a proposal to partition the land, but to give the Jews a little bit of it, which for us was the opportunity we had been waiting for in order to establish independence.
So Yaakov, at a place like this, we're really commemorating the memory of these young men and women who gave their lives in a period where independence for Israel was looking less and less likely.
That's an understatement. It looked almost against the odds and impossible. And it's important to emphasize that for the Jewish experience for the last 2,000 years, we have always been on the losing end. We've always been the persecuted ones. We've been on the run. And it generates a certain attitude that, how could you even believe that it could ever be different? We just experienced the Holocaust. We're talking about the 1947. You know, it's just 3 years after the gas chambers have ceased running. We've never experienced success and victory. And yet, it is the youth, and specifically the youth of this land, that has the faith, the confidence that we can do it. And we're going to do it by tapping in to the spirit, and it's the spirit of our forefathers, the spirit of the Maccabees, who also, 2,000 years ago, took up arms against a mighty empire and succeeded with the grace of God. But through the spirit that they exhibited, that's the source of inspiration. And that's the power that keeps us going, because the story we're going to tell today is mostly a story of defeats. These guys were executed. And the other places we're going to be visiting, we're going to be discovering and hearing stories of defeats on the battlefield and tremendous suffering. But this the spirit of confidence that we can do it, to not give up, that's going to see us through in the end.
You know, Yaakov, there's a very important message for our day right now. You know, right now, Israel's fighting an existential war. I kind of think of it as the second war of independence, because even with the other wars that Israel fought, we didn't have the whole world against us in the way that we do now, especially because the Biden administration has been betraying Israel. So there's a lot of similarities there. But also in America today, you know, the battle for where America's going, and there's really a lot of fear that what America is and what it's always been could be lost. And there's what the battle Israel's fighting, and I say this on my show all the time, is really one front in the global battle for Western civilization, and that has Judeo-Christian biblical underpinnings. So when we talk about this self-sacrifice, the sacrifice of people who have faith against all odds. While it's a story about this particular war, it's really a story about every war that good people who are on the side of good and on the side of God have been fighting against the forces of evil for all time. And it really should serve as an inspiration to us. You know, that spirit of self-sacrifice is something we really need to rediscover.
I just want to add one thing. I totally agree with you. I would just say that we, in some ways, we have a blessing, and that is that the choice is made very easy because it's existential. We have to stand up to the plate. We have to take up arms. We have to fight because the alternative is, as Mayor Feinstein said in his trial, the alternative is Treblinka. The alternative
Is Auschwitz.
Is Auschwitz. The alternative is death and destruction. So that's, in some sense, made it, I won't say easy, but it made it somewhat clearer what the job has to be done. They had no idea, these guys, that there was going to be a happy ending. They just knew they couldn't sit still, and they had to do something to save our people and to stand up for what's right.
This should be a lesson for all of us. We live in a tough time. We live in a time of great challenges. Let's draw strength off the heroes who gave their lives for the founding of the State of Israel, like those heroes who gave their lives for the founding of America, and let's rediscover that spirit of self-sacrifice. We'll be right back with more of the Israel Independence Day special on Eyes on Israel in a few moments.